Good morning, Katelyn.
Buongiorno, Roxy.
And good afternoon to Claire, joining us from Rome.
Hello.
Claire, did I say that right in Italian?
Yeah, sort of like in the movie Inglourious Bastards when Brad Pitt says it.
I do learn all my Italian from Brad Pitt. Mm-hmm.
There are worse things, honestly. So.
Well, as I'm confident our listeners know, this week Pope Francis died at 88 years old, and his death, well, not exactly unexpected. We have been preparing it for a while. It still profoundly affected people around the world, whether they were Catholic or not.
So we thought we'd do something a little different this week. We're recording this one day after the news that Pope Francis died of a stroke, and we've invited Religion News Service's papal expert to join us.
Claire Giangravé is the RNS Vatican reporter, and we were pleased to have her on the show to give us insight into Pope Francis and his legacy. She'll also give us a preview of what we can expect over the next few weeks at the Vatican and during the election of the new pope.
From Religion News Service, this is Saved by the City, and this week we're coming at you from 3 different cities. From Columbus, I'm Caitlin Beatty.
From Brooklyn, I'm Roxy Stone.
And from Rome, I'm Claire Giangravé.
Oh no, we're not going to be able to get your pronunciation perfect. We're going to Americanize it and butcher it.
I know. I always think I've got it,
sorry.
and then you say it, and I'm like, oh, not quite.
That was just so beautiful.
Pope Francis was elected to be Pope in 2013 as a successor to Pope Benedict, who retired. I wonder if we start with all of our first impressions of Francis. And Claire, as RNS's voice of the Vatican, let's start with you.
My first impression of Pope Francis was the one that I think everyone had when he walked out of the loggia of St. Peter and said that very unassuming buonasera, good evening to everyone. And he was wearing the ill-fitting clothes. He was smiling and beaming at the crowd. And there was a sudden feeling that something had changed. And then I had the opportunity to meet him personally. And I think the first time I met him was during a papal trip. And he greeted every one of the reporters. And we had a brief exchange where he held my hand and he looked at me, and it was something startling because I had met other popes before him, but rarely does a person in power look at you as if you're the only person in the room. And I think that was really something powerful that he did.
I will admit that up until that point, as an evangelical, I had not given a lot of thought to the Catholic Pope. But there was something about Francis's election that did stand out, even to us low church evangelicals. I remember a friend of mine who was evangelical, but kind of had spent a lot of time with Catholics. And I remember he posted something on social media where he called out how, in his opinion, amazing it was that this Pope had chosen Francis as his name. And I think he was the first Pope to do.
Technically, yeah, he's Francis the First, but I think maybe something in the 10th century. But
oh, right,
but
right.
Saint Francis was known as being pretty humble. He took vows of poverty. He was, a different kind of saint for a pope to choose as their name. And I think I remember being like, oh, this is something to pay attention to then.
Yeah, my impression of Pope Francis was that he understood the significance of mass media and gestures and symbols. And one of the images that sticks in my mind is of him washing the feet of youth in Argentina who were battling drug addiction in a rehabilitation center. And him bent down with a bowl washing this young man's feet, and just the power of that kind of symbol. The Pope is arguably the most famous Christian in the world. He's the person who most visibly embodies what Christian faith is all about, and that it really matters to have a pope who is, with his actions and gestures, challenging the perception that some people have that, the Vatican is all about kind of wealth and power and just amassing more for themselves.
Well, in addition to being Francis the First, Pope Francis was also the first non-European pope, having been born and raised in Argentina. He was a cardinal there as well. He's also the first Jesuit pope. Tell us, Claire, how you saw those qualities shape his time as pope.
Well, as he himself said, I come to you from the end of the world. And that really sort of turned the church upside down in a way. And I think it's also important to remember that, yes, he's from Argentina, so he brings that cultural, let's say, upside down view of the church and of society and the world. But he also was the son of migrants from Italy. And so the first trip he wanted to do, and actually wanted to pay for himself, he wanted to buy his own airline ticket. And then everyone had to say him, no, that doesn't work that way for you anymore, Pope Francis, was to go to Lampedusa, where migrants, at the time it was the height of the migrant crisis in Europe, and where migrants were being stranded and left in refugee camps while politicians argued about what to do with them. And that's one way in which we can see that imprint of his origin, his point of view. He looked beyond the divisions of a Western-centric perspective. We can see that in his diplomacy. We can see that his experience working in the poorest parts of Buenos Aires, among the slums and poverty, brought to him a very special attention towards the outcasts, the poor, the marginalized, the people who are not usually welcome in the church, as Katelyn was saying earlier. At the same time, though, when we think instead about his Jesuit background, Pope Francis had a really hard time as a Jesuit. He was kicked out of his order and just told to now you're going to go and hear confessions. Yeah, well, yeah, because he'd had some problems in running the Jesuits. He wasn't very liked. He had been opposed in some ways, and at one point he was sent off to just hear confessions, and that's what he thought he would do for the rest of his life. And that taught him a lot about leadership and what leadership means. And how do you change a structure? How do you get into a place that has its own way of doing things and you sort of try and influence it and change hearts and minds, is the word he would use very often, to bring it in the right direction. And there are so many ways in which he did that when he became Pope and reforming the Catholic Church and the Vatican.
So in your obituary of Francis that you wrote for RNS, you called Francis a charismatic reformer and a disruptor. So what made him charismatic? And then what ways did he disrupt the institution of the Catholic Church?
Well, I mean, he was a people person, and he also had a very great sense of humor. It was always very entertaining when he would be, strolled out somewhere and they'd put some funny hat on him, or he'd play with people, or he'd make jokes. He was always making jokes about himself. When he was getting sick towards the end, people would walk up to him and say, he'd say, "I'm not dead yet," So that's just part of his charisma and being able to talk to people, to everyone. But he really did disrupt the Catholic Church in two fundamental ways that are really connected. One of them is in terms of the just the Vatican structure. When he was appointed, he was supposed to clean up this institution following sexual abuse scandals, financial scandals. I mean, everything was going badly for the church at the time. And he got in and he did exactly that and got him a lot of enemies. He changed everything. He wrote a new constitution. He fired people. He appointed people. He promoted people so they would be out of the way for him to do things that he wanted to do. And that's such a big part of what Pope Francis did. And then on the other hand, one of the most, I think, captivating ideas he had was people are more important than ideas. Space is more important than time. These sound very abstract, but when you look at Pope Francis, he really enacted that strongly. These two aspects really influenced one another and in interesting ways that I think will live on.
Climate change was one of the most consistent topics of concern for Francis during his papacy. He wrote 2 encyclicals on it, and he made these real moves toward lowering the carbon footprint of the Vatican itself. For instance, Why do you think that issue, the climate change in particular, rose to the surface for him?
Well, obviously, he had had experience back in Argentina. He really had a keen interest, I should say, towards indigenous communities and the relationship that indigenous communities have towards spirituality and faith, but also towards the environment. And he saw the negative impact that a sort of careless, selfish, functionalistic view of society that only saw things as something to be used and then discarded was doing to the world, and how many discarded it was leaving behind. He wrote this encyclical, Laudato Si, which will be probably one of the lasting document of this pontificate. I mean, there are really many others that deserve mention in this short list, but Laudato Si, I've seen kids who were being imprisoned for advocating against climate change, holding it in their hands, or prayer groups coming together to read it, or atheists and non-Catholics holding it in their hands, Nobel Prize winners referencing it and saying, this is a document that we need to pay attention to. And I think because he understood that it's really not just about the environment. For Pope Francis, it was about our relationship to the environment, what it says about us in the way that we care for creation and what was given by God for us to be stewards of in a way. And again, all the many people who were impacted, often the ones who were not listened to, discarded, ignored, indigenous communities, people who live in islands who would be disappearing. He made a point of visiting those places, meeting with them, bringing that spotlight that followed him everywhere to those places in the world and making us Vatican reporters stop and say, there's something important happening here. And he really used that platform powerfully.
I think about maybe one of the most famous moments of his papacy when he was asked about gay priests, and he said, who am I to judge? And it was like, everyone was like, wait a minute, what is he saying? What is this going to mean for LGBTQ inclusion in the Catholic Church? So how would you frame his leadership and the moves he made? And I think the reality that he kind of didn't really make conservatives or liberals super happy on these issues.
Yeah, I think that advocates for LGBTQ Catholics and for women in the church have a sort of difficult relationship with Pope Francis when it comes to this issue. And I think they're coming to terms with it now that he has died in a very particular way, because they recognize that Pope Francis has given them a voice and a platform that they did not have before. And maybe that did not translate in doctrinal changes. And maybe it did not translate into getting the kind of change that many hoped would come with him. But the truth of the matter is, as we sort of ponder about who might be coming next, is that who will succeed Pope Francis might not be so willing to open that conversation. And so all of those groups, all of those advocates who for 13 years had a seat at the table, were invited to speak during synodal events, were treated with respect, were met with at the Vatican, they might not be listened to anymore. And it's a difficult thing to try and also to understand. But I mentioned earlier, Pope Francis really did think that people came before ideas. They didn't come before the gospel. So I'm not trying to say that Pope Francis is someone who's like, oh, forget, the Bible and, the doctrine. But when it comes to meeting with people, he was willing to say, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to look down at you. I mean, I did some reporting for RNS where I went on the outskirts of Rome and spent times with trans sex workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I saw that just the tremendous impact that it had for them when no one cared about them, that Pope Francis sent out his papal almoner to give them all money and to take care of them, give them COVID-19 vaccines, and then even brought them back to the Vatican for a full medical checkup. That's who he was. And it might not translate into a lasting legacy, but once the door is opened, it's hard to close. So we'll see. A lot depends on how much he was able to leave, to make sure his legacy outlasted him.
Yeah. And maybe say a little bit about women. He did appoint several women into leadership positions at the Vatican, though more administrative than ministerial. But, in the end, did not did not pass women's ordination as deacons, did not, called for more discussion and study on that, and, sort of frustrated a lot of women advocates.
Yes, and we saw that from women advocate groups, Catholic women advocate groups that have reacted to Pope Francis's death. I seem to remember that one of the statements said, it's surprising for such a revolutionary Pope that he was not able to bring the cause of women forward. And in many ways, yes, but I was thinking about this today as the cardinals are coming in, and I was thinking, that's really a man's club. It's a moment where no woman has access to that place. There's no way women can really be heard in that Sistine Chapel. It's a conclave, but it's especially conclave for women. And that conclave means with key, so closed. And what that means, I think, is that Pope Francis, though, has selected cardinals. And I know because these people have met during these synods, these gatherings of bishops in Rome. They have attended meetings and gatherings with women. I know that a lot of these prelates, even the conservative ones, you'd be surprised, care about women having a say in the church. They might not all agree on whether they should be ordained, whether they should be deacons, whether they should be priests, whether they should do something completely different, whether we should just take nuns and bring them up a notch. But they all, a really large majority of them, think that it's time for women to have a seat at the table in one way or in another. And that's really credit to Pope Francis.
What was Francis's relationship with the U.S. like? He was Pope for 3 different presidents, Obama and Biden and Trump twice. What do you think his relationship with the U.S. and U.S. politics was in the end?
We asked Pope Francis this question on the plane once. We said, listen, Your Holiness, some Americans really don't like you. And he said, I wear it as a badge of honor when Americans don't like me. And
mic drop.
Yeah, it was a very strong sentence, but I think it said something about this Pope. There was definitely, as a Latin American Pope, a sense that the United States' influence in the world is too incumbent and too powerful. And I think he had a pushback to the idea of the United States as being sheriffs of democracy in the world. When President Trump was elected, you could sort of say that Pope Francis was kind of the ghost of Trump's presidency in the sense that he was the one who went out and said, build bridges, not walls. And you think Trump is good at a slogan. Wait till you hear Pope Francis. Build bridges, not walls is a powerful slogan that says a lot about what this Pope stands for. Pontifex, bridge maker, bridge builder. That's what the Latin word means.
Well, as we round out this conversation about Francis, what do you think will be the most lasting impact of his time as Pope?
So, when the Pope died, the 3 major newspapers in Italy all had the same headline on their front page. And it said, Il Papa degli Ultimi. It's as if, like, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and whatever all had the same headline. And it said, the Pope of the least. I think that's very telling in the sense that anyone who has seen this Pope was impressed by his attention to his humility, those big gestures of humility, as you mentioned earlier, Katelyn, that he was able to convey beyond just believers. I was in the square today interviewing a lot of, pilgrims walking by. Many of them told me they're atheists, they don't have faith, they're not Catholic, maybe they're Protestant, and they all said, every one of them, I was surprised by his humility. He drew me in because of how simple he was. He pushed back against the sense that we all had to, that popes, belong to this sort of realm of wealth and privilege. And beyond all the rhetoric and beyond all the conversations and the in-depth analysis that one can do about his repercussions and lasting imprint on the Catholic Church, which are many, in the end of the day, I think for most people, Francis I will be remembered as the Pope of the least, the humble Pope.
Coming up, we'll cover what happens next as the Vatican prepares to choose a new Pope. Keep your eyes on that smokestack.
That's right. All your conclave questions answered, and we're going to put Claire in the hot seat.
What?
Right after a word about the awesomeness of RNS.
Religion News Service is an independent, award-winning source of global reporting on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics.
Get the dope on all the popes, all the cardinals, and their votes.
Some new love from Saved by the City listeners. Yo Soy Ashley Brooke reached out on Instagram to say, "Hi, I just discovered the pod and I'm really loving it. Keep up the good work, ladies. Ashley in Birmingham." In parentheses, she noted, a childless cat lady.
Thanks, Ashley. Also from the fan mailbag. Quote, Saved by the City has been saving my mental health and sanity ever since I started listening to podcasts in early March 2025. Your incisive wit and thoughtful takes on culture and theology had helped take my mind off things whenever I press play.
That's from Marilyn, who goes on to say, "I also want to thank whoever's responsible for the great musical accompaniments for segments, in addition to the stellar theme music." Well, that would be Martin Fowler on the theme music, and the music beds are curated by producer Jay Woodward. And I'll note he might have written this part of it, and it says, "Yay, Woodward."
I like to say yay, Beatty, too. We'd love to hear your feedback and ideas for future guests and topics. Drop us a review wherever you listen and shoot us an email at sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com. We want to hear from you.
That's really cute.
I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. This week on The State of Belief, searching for hope and action at Passover and Easter. We're going to hear amazing clips from recorded interviews with Bishop Marion Buddy, as well as Rabbi Jonah Pesner, and a reflection on Easter from Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Distributed by Religion News Service Podcasts and available on your favorite podcast app.
Well, as our listeners probably know, there was a recent Oscar-nominated movie about the Conclave and everything that happens in and around those closed doors. And that's where I get a lot of my info about how the Conclave happens. So how accurate was it?
We're going to find out soon. I agree. It was a great movie. My parents watched it recently, and my mom's takeaway was twist ending. I did not see that coming. Like, yeah, you're right. Stanley Tucci was great. John Lithgow was great. We would highly recommend it if you haven't seen it.
The thing about movies like this, though, as great as it was, is it does really leave you wondering, how accurate was it? How much did Hollywood put in there just for drama's sake? Can we expect such twist endings?
Well, luckily Claire is here and can help us fact-check Conclave the movie and put some questions to rest.
Okay, Claire, here we go. First off, did you see the movie, Claire?
Yes.
What did you think?
What did you think?
I really liked it. And I also think it's a very good representation of what happens during a conclave.
Okay. So the thing at the beginning, when the Pope dies, one of the people in the room with him takes the ring off his finger and whacks it with a hammer and chisel. Is that really a thing?
Absolutely, yes. It's true. It's a ceremony where the Camerlengo, the Chamberlain, uses a small silver hammer to destroy the piscatorial ring, which represents the power of the Pope. In the past, the Camerlengo would also bang it on the Pope's head 3 times to make sure he was dead, but we don't use that anymore.
And if he wasn't already dead, that killed him.
Just to make sure things were wrapped up. Okay, so in the movie, there are 135 Catholic cardinals, and they're sequestered like a jury in the Sistine Chapel until a pope is selected. Does that really happen? Do they have to stay sequestered until a pope is chosen?
That is also true. The idea is that conclave is a Latin term with key. They are closed in there and they can have no influence from the outside. They can't know what the news is. They can't do anything outside of that space. I believe there was a time where a conclave lasted like 3 years and it almost drove some cardinals mad. Yeah.
What?
Yeah, in 1268.
Oh my gosh. So obviously before the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah.
Dang.
That was like a tenth of those people's lives because they didn't want to live very long.
Wow. So
my Lord,
in the movie they showed the voting, and the way they did it was they wrote down their votes, put it into a big container that looks like an urn, and then maybe there was like some burning of it or something that happens later.
Yes, that is absolutely right. I mean, this Conclave movie got everything spot on.
That's
They
pretty
write
cool.
down the names secretly, they put it in the box, and then the contents are counted, announced to the cardinals, whether there was a pope or not, and then they are burned. And in modern times, they put a chemical inside the furnace so that the color of the smoke will be of different colors, either white or black. Black, no pope. White, habemus papam. We have a new pope.
Oh, so the smoke is actually coming from the burning of the votes.
Yes.
Interesting.
That's so cool.
I know. Leave it to the
Why
Catholics
don't
for
Protestant
drama.
denominations do this?
So they get a new SBC president. They can't even. Well, some of these cardinals in the conclave in the movie had some pretty dark secrets. There was a lot of politicking. There was a lot of undermining of some of the candidates, trying to bring out the dark secrets of their past. Is that just Hollywood trying to give us some drama and scandal, or is that really happening?
Well, that's the problem with conclaves. I mean, I can't
You don't know.
actually answer the question. You know what? I'm going to say, I think yes. Maybe not as, I mean, not literally pulling out, ex-lovers and dirty laundry, but, I'm sure that in 2,000 years of history, that room must have seen things.
Oh, yeah.
Especially during the 3-year period.
Yeah. Some of their candidates might have literally died during the conclave.
I believe that. Oh, I'm sure cardinals died during the conclave. That has happened.
Mm-hmm. Okay, finally, so in the movie, the cardinal who eventually is elected pope was made a cardinal in pectore, which is a Latin phrase meaning in the heart. What does that mean, and does that actually happen?
Yes, that is also true. Again, proving that Conclave is the ultimate movie for conclaves, apparently. But it's a term referencing that if the Pope puts his hand on your chest and makes you a prince of the church, we don't use that term anymore, a cardinal, then you could be a cardinal. But theoretically, they would have to be announced to the College of Cardinals before the conclave begins. So it couldn't have happened in the movie where, surprise, there's a new guy in here. Too many risks.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right. All your conclave questions answered. Now let's talk about the actual conclave that is about to happen.
So what can we expect to happen over the next 2 weeks at the Vatican before the next conclave?
So right now, Pope Francis's remains are presented in St. Peter's Basilica for faithful to go and visit and pay their last respects to. There've been lines of faithful coming to honor the Pope. And then after a funeral mass that takes place on Saturday and will be led by the Dean of the College of Cardinals, the Pope's body, as was his wish in his last testament, will be brought over from St. Peter's to the Basilica of St. Mary Major of Rome. This is not a strange place. It is one of the titular basilicas of Rome, meaning one of the most important ones, and one that Pope Francis had a special devotion to because he loved the Virgin Mary. He would go to this church every time he left for a papal trip, before and after. He would go there. He went there even after he left the hospital, or even if he had to face some difficult challenge in his life. So he wants to be put there to rest. And so he has made changes to the way that the funerals work in the Vatican. And there will be a small ceremony there as well. And after a 9-day period of mourning, which might be a little longer, a little shorter, and during which cardinals will be coming in from all over the world to these general congregations, which are meetings where they start to discuss about what's going to happen in the future of the church, we will have a conclave. Now, these general congregations are not really it doesn't have a cardinal stand up and say, I think I should be the next pope because so-and-so, or I want to propose this guy because I think he's the best. It's a lot of reading between the lines, presenting a vision for the church. And if you know enough about the place, they might be hinting at some guy or another. Sometimes they allow us reporters to be in the room when that happens, but not always. And then when the conclave starts, I mean, the past 5 conclaves have lasted about 3 days. So from the death of Pope Francis until the election of a new one, this period that is known as sede vacante, means an empty seat. It's about 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks.
RNS reporter Jack Jenkins noted that 135 cardinals will elect the next pope, and of those 135 cardinals, Francis picked 108 of them. Does that suggest the next pope is likely to carry on Francis's agenda and legacy?
Yes, of course, Pope Francis has appointed a majority that could potentially elect his successor, but the conclave that elected Pope Francis, whom we referred to as a progressive pope, was handpicked by John Paul II and Benedict XVI. These are conservative popes, or definitely more conservative than Pope Francis, which tells us that conclaves are not that much about stacking the odds in your favor. And it's surprising what happens to people's minds and opinions once the person that selected them is no longer there. So what's really going to be important are those people that Pope Francis has appointed who will be surrounding it. These are normally the cardinals who are over 80 years old, because you can't be elected pope if you're over 80. And these guys have had a lot of experience, have met with a lot of people in and around the church. They know Pope Francis and his vision. And more than that, they can sort of act like Sherpas to the conclave. When they meet with these guys, they can say, listen, how are you feeling? What's the situation? Because they can't vote, but they know enough to help and massage the conversation in one way and another. People who are close to the Pope know what his vision is and are going to be there sort of, in a way, representing him even after he's dead.
Thinking about all these cardinals coming from all over the world, and they're in this lock and key place, like, what if they don't all speak the same language? They don't. So how do they talk to each other?
I'm so glad you asked me that question, because it's really important. One of the qualities that a new pope usually has is being a polyglot, speaking a lot of languages, or having at least someone on your team, although that's not a very nice way to put it, who does speak a lot of languages. You can sit at the different tables and talk to everyone. And that's why we can look at some people in a way and say, oh, he fits the bill. That's how you start making a list of papabili. That's, again, the word that we used to say people who could become pope. You start saying, okay, who speaks a lot of languages? Who knows how the Vatican works? Who has experience in running an organization, a church, a parish, a diocese? And then once you put all these things together with experience and possibly even charisma, you got yourself a candidate.
As a final question, you've mentioned this papabili word that I clearly just butchered.
No, you didn't.
So this is a list of the favorites or the preferred candidates for next pope. So tell us about your own papabile list and who you think might be the leading candidates.
So there's some candidates that are evergreens. Every time a pope dies, his Secretary of State is considered a papabile. That's just because that's his number 2 guy. Second most powerful person in the church, knows everyone, does a lot. And in this case, he's also schooled in diplomacy, helped broker the deal with China, and someone who is recognized as being able to talk to all sides of the church. This man is Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and he is very much appreciated by conservatives and progressives alike. Then we have the Italian camp. The Italians think that it's been too long since Paul VI, since we've had an Italian pope, and they think it's time to bring Italy back to the Vatican. And the polarization that has seeped within, that exists within our society has seeped within the Catholic Church as well. So you could look at the Italian candidates as sort of falling into these 2 categories. On the progressive side, you have Cardinal Matteo Zuppi. He's the head of the bishops in Italy, but he was also Pope Francis's peace envoy in Ukraine. He traveled to Beijing, Washington, to Moscow, and to Kiev to try and broker a peace. This guy is definitely considered a leading candidate to become the next pope. Then you have Cardinal Filoni on the other side, a little older, and some people might like that. They might not want a young pope. They'll want a long pontificate. more traditional, attached to the curia, might rein things in a little bit. Then you've got your international crowd, because very big group of these candidates are going to come from Asia and Africa. Now, we tend to pile these together, but the truth of the matter is they're very different, and they have very different concerns and priorities for the church. For Asia, for example, a very good candidate would probably be Cardinal Tagle. He's a Filipino cardinal, very charismatic, great work with young kids in his native country and beyond. And he's known as the Asian Francis. He has a penchant for crying and being very emotional during public appearances, but he's criticized as not being a very good manager, but always put in the list as someone who might be the next pope. And then you've got some of these African cardinals. Cardinal Bazungu, for example, from Congo, is one of the representatives who has a greater chance from Africa. He, you would say, is sort of progressive on issues like migration and also the environment. He is sort of against colonialization in Africa and beyond, but he also has a very traditional view of family. Might be a good choice for people who are looking for an in-between, between Pope Francis and more progressive options. Then you have the ultra-conservatives. Definitely leaders in that rank would be Cardinal Sarah, open critic of the Pope during his pontificate, very charismatic, a friend of Benedict XVI, who criticized Pope Francis on his opening towards removing celibacy for priests, allowing women to the priesthood, etc., etc. He's definitely leading that charge, and there are others who would follow after him as well. There are then some dark horses that I think deserve to be mentioned. One of them is Cardinal Arborelius, who would probably hate to be on this list, but he's often mentioned. He's from Sweden. He is a center guy. He understands the problems of Europe. He understands Pope Francis's vision, but at the same time, he wants to allow people to live out their faith in their own way without limitations. I would definitely put him in the center camp, despite him being a Western candidate. And then you have, someone that I put in my lists, but I rarely see in others, and that's Cardinal Konrad Krajewski, a little young. I believe he's 16, maybe younger. And he's from Poland.
Wait, that's young?
Yeah. Because it means,
so they can't be 80?
Because it means
they can't be over 80?
A 20-year papacy, probably.
Yeah.
Right.
So 20 years of the same pope. If you don't like the pope, it's a long time.
It's a long time. Yeah. Okay, please continue.
And that's how the cardinals are thinking. And that might be the rest of their lives,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right.
I always put Krajewski in it because he's the papal almoner. He's the face of Pope Francis's charity, but he's also from Poland, a traditionally conservative state. John Paul II guy. He's the one who crawled into a sewer once and reattached the electricity for these people living in poverty in Rome, and then told the mayor of the city, just send the bill to the Vatican. He's a kind of superhero guy, unassuming, probably not going to be the next pope, but maybe I would like him to be.
I was going to ask who's your choice? Not that you're going to be in conclave for all the reasons we.
Well, okay, my sentimental choice is Cardinal. So when I'll be in the conclave and making this decision, I will be voting for Cardinal Krajewski, and then once I realize I'm the only vote for Krajewski, I will vote for Parlin.
Thank you so much for giving us your expertise today amid a lot of reporting that you need to do and interviews and getting featured on all of the CNN and NPR and all the places. And, thanks for...
You're such a wealth of knowledge, Claire, and I hope our listeners will follow your continued Vatican coverage at religionnews.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's so much fun to be here.
Saved by the City is a Religion News Service production. The producer is Jay Woodward, and the consulting editor is Paul O'Donnell. Our editor is Julia Wyndham.
Chaz Rousseau put together our look, and Martin Fowler wrote our theme music.
We are Roxy Stone.
And Caitlin Beatty.
And Claire Giangravé from Rome.
Thanks for listening.